Richard Langley was a man of undeniable success. At 56 years old, his name had become synonymous with wealth, philanthropy, and social responsibility. He was the kind of man who appeared to have everything: a sprawling estate in the countryside, a seat on the boards of some of the most influential companies in the world, and an impeccable reputation. For all intents and purposes, Richard had reached the pinnacle of success. Yet for all the accolades, there was a strange emptiness that had begun to gnaw at him. As the years went on, he found himself increasingly disconnected from the world around him. Richard had always been the type of person to stay busy, to keep moving forward, to focus on the next project, the next deal, the next charitable initiative. But as he grew older, a part of him began to wonder what all of it truly meant. He had never been married and had no children, at least not that he acknowledged. His relationships were fleeting, often shallow, devoid of the depth and connection he craved. Richard found solace in his work, burying himself in the responsibilities that came with his wealth. Yet, no matter how much he achieved, a lingering sense of something important missing gnawed at him. One brisk autumn afternoon in the city, everything changed. Richard had just stepped out of a business meeting at his headquarters and decided to take a walk down the busy streets. He enjoyed these moments of solitude, even amid the crowds. It gave him time to think and reflect on his life and the world around him. As he walked, he noticed a young man sitting on the sidewalk, a cardboard sign propped up next to him asking for help. The man was homeless, his clothes tattered, his face marked with the weariness of someone who had seen too much struggle in too few years. Yet there was something about him that made Richard stop in his tracks, something he couldn't quite place. The teenager, no more than 17 or 18 years old, looked up as Richard approached. Their eyes met, and for a brief moment, it felt as if the world around them fell away. The young man had the same piercing blue eyes as Richard, the same sharp jawline, even the same slight cleft in the chin that Richard had inherited from his father. The resemblance was uncanny. Richard's heart raced. He stood frozen in place, staring at the young man. It wasn't just the physical resemblance that unsettled him. It was the way the teenager looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and recognition, as if he too could sense an inexplicable connection between them. "Can I help you with something?" the young man asked, his voice hesitant. Richard blinked, snapping out of his daze. "I'm sorry," he stammered. "I didn't mean to stare." "It's all right," the teenager said with a small shrug, though his expression remained wary. People stare all the time for reasons. For reasons Richard couldn't explain, he felt an overwhelming need to know more about this young man. It was as if fate had placed him in Richard's path, and now that their lives had intersected, Richard couldn't simply walk away. "What's your name?" Richard asked, his voice softening. "Chris," the young man replied. "Chris Johnson," Richard repeated, nodding slowly. "How long have you been out here?" Chris shrugged again. "A couple of months, I guess. Been bouncing around trying to find work." He trailed off, his expression darkening. "It's hard when you're just another black kid with no connections. No one really cares." Richard felt a pang of guilt at the boy's words. He knew that the world was full of injustices, full of people who slipped through the cracks. But this felt different. There was something personal about this encounter that made him feel as though he had failed in some way. "Where's your family?" Richard asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "Don't have much of one," Chris said simply. "My mom passed away last year. She was all I had." Richard's heart sank. He wanted to offer some kind of comfort, but the words felt hollow in his mouth. What could he possibly say to a young man who had been dealt such a difficult hand in life? What right did he have to offer sympathy when he had lived a life of privilege? "Do you have a place to stay tonight?" Richard asked. Chris shook his head. "I'll figure something out. I usually do." Richard's mind raced. He couldn't just leave this young man here on the street. There was a part of him, an inexplicable, undeniable part that felt responsible for Chris. It was as if some invisible thread connected them, pulling Richard deeper into this boy's life. "Come with me," Richard said suddenly, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. Chris frowned, his guard immediately going up. "Why?" "I want to help you," Richard said earnestly. "Just for tonight. I have a place nearby. You can get cleaned up, have a meal, get some rest. Then we can figure out what to do next." Chris hesitated, clearly torn between skepticism and desperation. Richard could see the wheels turning in his mind, weighing the risks and rewards of accepting help from a stranger. "Look, I know this is weird," Richard added, sensing Chris's reluctance. "But I swear I just want to help. No strings attached." After what felt like an eternity, Chris finally nodded. "All right," he said quietly, "but just for tonight." Richard breathed a sigh of relief. He hailed a cab, and the two of them rode in silence back to Richard's penthouse. As they stepped inside, Chris's eyes widened at the sheer opulence of the place. The marble floors, the floor-to-ceiling windows with a view of the city skyline. It was a far cry from the streets he'd been living on. "You live here?" Chris asked, his voice filled with awe. Richard nodded, feeling a pang of discomfort at the stark contrast between their lives. "Yeah," he said, trying to keep his tone light. Chris didn't say anything more, but Richard could see the gears turning in his mind. He knew the young man was trying to make sense of why someone like him, someone with all this wealth, would take an interest in a homeless kid. Richard wasn't entirely sure himself. As Chris showered and changed into some of Richard's clothes, Richard couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter was more than just a coincidence. There was something about Chris that tugged at his soul, something that made him question everything he thought he knew about his own life. The next few days were a blur. Richard arranged for Chris to stay in a hotel, gave him some money, and began making calls to try to find him a job. But all the while, Richard's obsession with the young man grew. The resemblance was too strong, too specific to ignore. Richard found himself fixated on the idea that Chris was more than just a random stranger. There had to be a reason they had crossed paths. Finally, unable to shake the feeling, Richard made a decision. He asked Chris if he would be willing to take a DNA test. Chris was understandably confused. "Why would I do that?" he asked, suspicion creeping into his voice. "I don't know how to explain it," Richard said, his voice tinged with desperation. "But I think we might be related." Chris stared at him, his eyes narrowing. "What, like you think you're my long-lost uncle or something?" Richard shook his head. "No," he said softly. I think I might be your father." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and impossible. Chris looked at Richard like he had just sprouted a second head. "You're kidding, right?" he said, half laughing, half disbelieving. "I'm not," Richard said quietly. "I know it sounds crazy, but there's something about you, something that feels too familiar. I had a relationship years ago before I became who I am now. It was brief, and I never knew what came of it. But I can't shake the feeling that you might be my son." Chris stared at Richard for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, without a word, he nodded. "Fine," he said. "I'll take the test." The days that followed were agonizing for Richard. He couldn't concentrate on anything else. The thought that Chris might be his son consumed him. He replayed the past in his mind, trying to piece together the timeline, wondering if it was possible that he had a child he never knew about. It seemed impossible, and yet the resemblance was undeniable. When the results finally came back, Richard's heart nearly stopped. The test confirmed what he had suspected all along. Chris was his biological son. Richard sat in stunned silence, staring at the report in his hands. He had a son he had never known, a son who had grown up in poverty on the streets while Richard had lived a life of luxury and privilege. The weight of it was crushing. All the success, all the wealth, it meant nothing in the face of this revelation. Richard had failed. He had failed Chris, and he had failed the woman who had raised him alone. Richard sat in the quiet of his study, the DNA test results still spread out before him on the desk. The realization that Chris was his son hit him with a force he hadn't anticipated. How could this have happened? How had he not known? His mind raced back to the woman he had loved in his youth, a vibrant soul who had filled his life with joy before they had gone their separate ways. He had never thought about the possibility of a child, let alone the possibility of never meeting him. Just then, Chris walked into the room, a hesitant look on his face. "You okay?" he asked, glancing at the papers on the desk. Richard took a deep breath, knowing he had to tell Chris the truth. "Chris," he began, his voice steady but tinged with emotion, "I need to talk to you about something important." Chris took a step closer, his expression shifting from curiosity to concern. "What is it?" Richard's heart raced. "The DNA results came back and—" He paused, searching for the right words. "You're my son." Chris stared at him, disbelief etched on his face. "What?" he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're my son," Richard repeated, this time with conviction. "I never knew. I didn't know you existed until recently." Chris stepped back, his eyes wide with shock. "No way. This is some kind of sick joke, right? You don't even know me." "I know," Richard replied, his voice earnest. "But I want to know you. I want to be a part of your life. I want to help you." Chris shook his head, a mixture of anger and confusion flooding his expression. "You can't just show up out of nowhere and expect me to believe you care." "I know it's overwhelming," Richard said, desperation creeping into his tone. "But please, just give me a chance. I want to make things right." Chris was silent, the weight of Richard's words hanging heavy in the air. Richard could see the conflict in Chris's eyes, the battle between disbelief and the hope that had long been extinguished. Days turned into weeks, and as Richard and Chris spent more time together, the initial shock began to wear off. Slowly, Chris began to open up, sharing stories about his life and the hardships he had faced. Richard listened, his heart aching for the boy who had spent so long alone. They went to dinner, played basketball in the park, and began to forge a bond that was both tentative and profound. It felt as if they were building something new from the ashes of their past, and Richard was determined to be a better father than he had been in the past. One afternoon, as they walked through a local art gallery, Chris turned to Richard, a thoughtful look on his face. "You know, I never thought I'd have a dad," he admitted, his voice quiet. "Not a real one, anyway. I always wondered what it would be like to have someone who cared." Richard felt a wave of guilt wash over him. "I'm sorry for not being there for you," he said sincerely. "I never wanted to hurt you. I just didn't know you existed." Chris nodded, though Richard could see the pain lingering in his eyes. "I get it," he said slowly, "but it still sucks. You had a life, a family, everything I always wanted. And I was out here on my own." Richard felt the weight of Chris's words, the bitterness of regret choking him. "I can't change the past," he said softly, "but I want to do everything I can to make it up to you now. You deserve a chance." As they walked through the gallery, Richard felt a renewed sense of purpose. He wanted to help Chris find a way to achieve his dreams, to break the cycle of hardship that had plagued his life. One day, Richard surprised Chris with a visit to a local community center where they offered programs for underprivileged youth. "I thought you might want to check this out," Richard said, gesturing to the building. Chris looked at him, a mix of surprise and skepticism on his face. "What is this place?" "It's a place where you can learn new skills, get support, and find opportunities. I thought you might be interested in taking some classes, maybe even find a job." Chris glanced at the center, uncertainty flickering in his eyes. "Do you really think it could help?" "I believe in you," Richard replied earnestly. "I think you can do anything you set your mind to." Chris hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Okay, let's check it out. As they entered the community center, Richard felt a sense of hope blooming within him. He was finally doing something meaningful, finally taking steps to ensure that Chris had a brighter future. Over the next few months, Richard continued to support Chris in every way he could. He helped him enroll in classes, secured a part-time job, and encouraged him to pursue his passion for art. Chris flourished in this new environment, slowly discovering his own potential and reclaiming the dreams that had once felt so out of reach. One evening, as they sat on the balcony of Richard's penthouse, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Chris turned to Richard, a thoughtful expression on his face. "You know, this is kind of nice," he said, his voice soft. "Having you around." Richard felt a swell of emotion at Chris's words. "I'm glad to hear that," he said, trying to keep his tone light. "I want us to be a family." Chris smiled, a real smile that lit up his face. "Yeah, me too." As Richard watched Chris laugh, he felt a sense of joy he had never experienced before. The emptiness that had haunted him for so long began to fade, replaced by the warmth of connection and love. In that moment, Richard realized that family wasn't just about blood. It was about the bonds you created, the moments you shared, and the love you nurtured. With Chris by his side, he felt a renewed sense of purpose, a commitment to building a future together that neither of them had thought possible. Richard's life had been irrevocably changed the day he met Chris. What had begun as an encounter filled with uncertainty had blossomed into a relationship that held the promise of healing, redemption, and a chance for a brighter tomorrow. Together, they were learning to navigate the complexities of their past while forging a path toward a future filled with hope, laughter, and the love of a father and son.